Rebecca Sinclair's heart hammered wildly against her ribs as the jeering crowd pressed closer to the auction block. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on her exposed shoulders, her dress deliberately torn to reveal more skin than she'd ever shown in public. Sweat trickled down her spine, mingling with tears she refused to shed as the auctioneer circled her like a vulture. "What'll you give for this fine filly, gentlemen? 20 years old, healthy as a horse, and pretty enough to make your breakfast every morning with a smile." The auctioneer's voice boomed across the dusty town square of Silver Creek, Colorado, in the summer of 1875. Rebecca kept her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to acknowledge the hungry stares from the men gathered around the wooden platform. 3 days ago, she'd been the respectable daughter of a merchant. Now, after her father's sudden death and the discovery of his overwhelming debts, she was property to be sold to the highest bidder. The coarse rope binding her wrists cut into her skin as she shifted her weight. Her once fine blue dress hung in tatters, deliberately damaged by the debt collector to display her assets to potential buyers. The shame burned hotter than the July sun, but Rebecca held her chin high, clinging to the last shreds of her dignity. "Let's start the bidding at $50. "Who'll give me 50 for this fine specimen of womanhood?" "50," called a gravelly voice from the crowd. Rebecca's stomach lurched as she recognized the voice of Horace Wilkins, the saloon owner whose reputation for cruelty toward his employees was well known throughout the territory. 60. Countered another man, a cattle driver whose breath reeked of whiskey even from 10 feet away. The bids climbed higher, each number hammering another nail into the coffin of Rebecca's former life. 75, 90, 120. $200, came a new voice, low and steady as a mountain stream. A hush fell over the crowd as it parted to reveal a tall figure on horseback. The stranger's face was partially obscured by the brim of a black Stetson, but Rebecca could make out a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality: a dark shirt, leather vest, and denim pants tucked into well-used boots. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster holding what appeared to be a Colt revolver. "Well now," the auctioneer said, recovering quickly. "200 from the gentleman on horseback." "Do I hear 220? 250, Wilkins countered, his piggy eyes narrowing at the newcomer. The stranger didn't speak again. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch. With deliberate movements, he appended it over his palm. Gold coins caught the sunlight, glinting like tiny suns. $500 in gold, he stated simply, his voice carrying across the now silent square. Cash, right now. The auctioneer's eyes widened at the sight of actual gold rather than paper notes or promises. $500. Do I hear any other bids? Rebecca watched Wilkins' face contort with fury, but even the saloon owner knew when he was outmatched. $500 in gold was a fortune in this small mining town. Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman on the horse. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing his considerable height. He approached the auction block, boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. Up close, Rebecca could see his eyes, a clear, piercing blue that assessed her condition with a quick glance. "The name's Daniel Blackwood," he said quietly as he handed the pouch to the auctioneer, who quickly began counting the gold pieces. "You're free to go wherever you want after this, madam. I'm just settling an old debt." Rebecca stared at him in confusion. "I don't know you, sir." "What debt do you speak of?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Not with you. Consider it a debt to humanity." He turned to the auctioneer. "Cut her bonds, now." The man hastily complied, slicing through the rope with a pocket knife. Rebecca rubbed her chafed wrists, still trying to comprehend what was happening. "You can't just free her," Wilkins protested, stepping forward. "That's not how this works. You bought her fair and square." Daniel Blackwood turned slowly to face the saloon owner, his hand resting casually near his holster. "The lady is not property, regardless of what this auction might suggest. I paid to ensure her freedom, not to own her." The crowd murmured, many nodding in agreement while others seemed disappointed by this turn of events. The debt collector who had arranged the auction pushed his way forward. "Now see here," he began, but faltered when Blackwood's cold gaze shifted to him. "I believe our business is concluded," Blackwood said. He turned back to Rebecca and offered his hand. "Madam, would you care to step down from there? This spectacle has gone on long enough." Rebecca hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. His palm was calloused but warm, his grip gentle as he helped her down from the auction block. Her legs trembled, threatening to give way after hours of standing. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching. "But I have nowhere to go. They've seized my father's house and all our possessions." Blackwood nodded as if he'd expected this. "There's a respectable boarding house run by the widow Cooper at the edge of town. I can escort you there if you wish." "I have no money," Rebecca admitted, the shame washing over her anew. "Consider your first week paid for," he replied, reaching into his pocket and pressing several coins into her palm. "After that, I'm sure Mrs. Cooper can help you find suitable employment." Rebecca stared at the money in disbelief. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me." Something flickered in his blue eyes, a shadow of old pain, quickly masked. "Let's just say I've seen enough injustice in this world to last several lifetimes. I couldn't ride past and do nothing." As the crowd dispersed, some casting curious glances their way, Blackwood led Rebecca toward his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that stood patiently waiting. "This is Thunder," he said, patting the horse's neck. "He doesn't mind carrying double for a short distance." Rebecca looked down at her torn dress, suddenly acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. "I can't be seen like this." Without hesitation, Blackwood shrugged out of his long duster coat and held it out to her. "It's not the latest fashion, but it'll cover you until we reach Mrs. Cooper's." The coat enveloped her, still warm from his body and carrying the scent of leather, tobacco, and something uniquely male. Rebecca pulled it close, grateful for the modesty it provided. With surprising gentleness, Blackwood helped her mount Thunder before swinging up behind her. The closeness of his body sent an unexpected shiver through Rebecca that had nothing to do with fear. "Hang on," he murmured, reaching around her to take the reins. His chest pressed against her back as Thunder began to move, and Rebecca found herself leaning into the solid strength of the stranger who had just spent a fortune to set her free. As they rode through town, Rebecca kept her head high despite the stares. The humiliation of the auction block was still raw, but something new flickered in her heart, a tiny spark of hope that perhaps her life wasn't over after all. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." His response rumbled against her back. "There's nothing to repay, Miss Sinclair," she supplied. "Rebecca Sinclair." "Miss Sinclair," he continued, "I didn't do this expecting anything in return. Some things are simply the right thing to do." Rebecca wondered what kind of man could say such words and mean them. In her experience, men always wanted something in return for their generosity. "Still," she persisted, $500 is a fortune. You could have bought land or cattle or it's just money," he interrupted. "And it seems to me you needed it more than I did today." They continued in silence until they reached a neat two-story house at the edge of town. A hand-painted sign declaring Cooper's Boarding House Clean Rooms, fair prices hung by the door. As Blackwood helped Rebecca dismount, their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary. She looked up to find him studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Will you be staying in town long, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. A small smile touched his lips. "I hadn't planned to, but I might reconsider." "Good day, Miss Sinclair." With that, he mounted his horse and tipped his hat before riding away, leaving Rebecca standing on the doorstep of her new beginning, clutching his coat around her shoulders and wondering if she would ever see Daniel Blackwood again. As Rebecca's fingers hovered over the boarding house door, it swung open to reveal a plump, gray-haired woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense expression. "I've been expecting you," the woman said, ushering Rebecca inside. "Word travels fast in Silver Creek. I'm Eleanor Cooper." Rebecca clutched Blackwood's coat tighter around her shoulders. "How did you?" The Martin's boy came running to tell me. "Said a stranger paid your freedom in gold and was bringing you here." Mrs. Cooper's eyes held no judgment as she assessed Rebecca's condition. "Let's get you cleaned up and into some proper clothes, dear." The interior of the boarding house was modest but immaculately clean, with polished wooden floors and simple furnishings. Mrs. Cooper led Rebecca upstairs to a small but comfortable bedroom with a narrow bed, washstand, and dresser. "This will be your room for now," the older woman explained, opening a trunk at the foot of the bed. "I keep spare clothes for emergencies. They might not fit perfectly, but they'll do until we can get you something better." Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes at this unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Cooper. Mr. Blackwood said he paid for a week's lodging." "He did indeed," Mrs. Cooper confirmed, pulling out a simple cotton dress. "Left a note with young Tommy saying you'd be needing a safe place. Paid for 2 weeks, actually, not just one." Rebecca's fingers tightened on the coat. 2 weeks. The generosity of this stranger continued to astonish her. After a hot bath that washed away the grime and humiliation of the auction block, Rebecca donned the borrowed dress. It was plain but clean, a faded blue that hung slightly loose on her frame. She carefully folded Blackwood's coat, running her fingers over the worn leather before setting it aside. When she descended to the kitchen, Mrs. Cooper was preparing supper. The older woman gestured for Rebecca to sit at the table where a cup of steaming tea waited. "Now then," Mrs. Cooper said, sitting across from her, "we should discuss your situation. I understand your father passed recently." Rebecca nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. 3 weeks ago. "Heart failure," the doctor said. "I had no idea we were in such debt." Mr. Finch, the debt collector, appeared the day after the funeral with papers showing father owed money to half the businesses in town. "Jacob Finch is a vulture," Mrs. Cooper said with uncharacteristic venom. "He's been waiting for your father to falter for years. There's bad blood there dating back to before you were born." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Cooper sighed. "Your father never told you? He and Finch were rivals for your mother's hand. When she chose your father, Finch never forgave him." Rebecca stared in shock. "He sold me at auction because of a decades-old grudge. I wouldn't put it past him. Finch has waited a long time for revenge." Mrs. Cooper patted Rebecca's hand. "But that's the past now. We need to think about your future. Can you sew?" "Yes, quite well. Mother taught me before she died." "Good. Mrs. Abernathy at the dress shop needs an assistant. Her arthritis makes fine needlework difficult these days. I'll speak to her tomorrow." Relief flooded through Rebecca. "I don't know how to thank you." "Thank that cowboy of yours, Mrs. Cooper replied with a small smile. "Not many men would part with $500 in gold for a stranger." "He's not my cowboy," Rebecca protested, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. Mrs. Cooper's knowing look only deepened Rebecca's blush. "Well, whoever he is, he certainly made quite an impression riding into town like that. Reminds me of stories I heard about him years ago. You know Mr. Blackwood, not personally, but his reputation precedes him." Daniel Blackwood was a legend during the war, a scout for the Union Army with an uncanny ability to track and survive. After the war, he became something of a wandering lawman, taking jobs that needed doing but that no one else wanted. Mrs. Cooper set a plate of stew before Rebecca. "They say he's as dangerous as he is honorable, a rare combination in these parts." Rebecca ate slowly, contemplating this information. "Why would such a man concern himself with my troubles?" Mrs. Cooper shrugged. "That, my dear, is something only he could tell you." Over the next few days, Rebecca settled into a routine. Mrs. Abernathy had indeed needed help at the dress shop and was delighted to discover Rebecca's skill with a needle. The pay was modest but fair, and the work itself was pleasant. With each stitch, Rebecca rebuilt her sense of independence, piece by piece, but her thoughts often strayed to Daniel Blackwood. She found herself watching the street through the shop window, hoping for a glimpse of a black Stetson and chestnut stallion. His coat hung in her room, a tangible reminder of his kindness that she couldn't bring herself to part with. A week after the auction, the bell above the dress shop door jingled. Rebecca looked up from the wedding gown she was hemming to find Daniel Blackwood filling the doorway, his tall frame seeming too large for the dainty shop. Her heart stuttered in her chest. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, setting aside her work and rising to her feet. "What a surprise." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Miss Sinclair, I was passing by and thought I'd see how you're faring." Mrs. Abernathy emerged from the back room, her face lighting up at the sight of a potential customer. When Rebecca introduced them, the older woman's eyes widened in recognition. "The auction hero," she said, nodding approvingly. "Well, Mr. Blackwood, I'm in your debt for bringing me such a talented assistant." Rebecca's fingers work magic with needle and thread. Blackwood's eyes moved to Rebecca, a hint of warmth softening their blue depths. "I'm not surprised to hear it." Mrs. Abernathy glanced between them with a knowing smile. "Rebecca, dear, why don't you take your lunch break now? It's such a lovely day for a walk." Before Rebecca could protest, her employer had disappeared into the back room, leaving her alone with Blackwood. "I have your coat," Rebecca said, flustered by the unexpected meeting. "At the boarding house. I can return it to you." "There's no rush," he replied. His eyes never left her face, studying her as if memorizing every feature. "You look well, Miss Sinclair." "Thanks to you," she gathered her courage. Would you allow me to buy you lunch? It's the least I can do to thank you." A small smile touched his lips. "I'd be honored. Though I believe I just heard your employer suggest a walk instead." Rebecca reached for her shawl. "There's a nice spot by the creek where I sometimes take my lunch. We could talk there if you don't mind the simplicity." They walked in companionable silence through town, aware of the curious glances from townsfolk. Rebecca had become accustomed to the whispers that followed her, but today they seemed focused more on her companion than on her scandal. The creek burbled peacefully at the edge of town, a grassy bank providing a pleasant spot to sit beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree. Rebecca spread her shawl on the ground and unpacked the simple lunch she'd brought: bread, cheese, and an apple, which she offered to share. "You found work quickly," Blackwood commented, accepting a piece of cheese. "Mrs. Cooper was instrumental in that. She seems to know everyone in town." Rebecca studied him as he ate. In daylight, she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into the sun. A thin scar ran along his jawline, barely visible beneath his stubble. "She also seems to know about you." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? She mentioned you were a scout during the war and later some kind of lawman." Rebecca hesitated. "Is that why you're in Silver Creek?" "Official business?" He took a bite of bread, chewing thoughtfully before answering. "Not exactly. I was tracking someone, but the trail went cold north of here. I was passing through on my way to Denver when I saw the auction." "Who were you tracking?" A shadow passed over his face. "A man who's left a trail of grief behind him. It's not a pleasant story for such a fine day." Rebecca sensed his reluctance and changed the subject. "Will you be staying in town long?" "I hadn't planned to," he admitted. His eyes met hers and something in them made her breath catch. "But I find myself reconsidering." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Rebecca looked down at her hands, suddenly shy. "I still don't understand why you did it," she said softly. $500 in gold for a stranger's freedom." Blackwood was quiet for so long that Rebecca thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and serious. 7 years ago, I was in a small town in Texas. There was a young woman being sold to cover her brother's gambling debts. I had money then too, but not enough. His jaw tightened at the memory. I watched her sold to a man whose reputation was well known for cruelty. 2 months later, I returned to find she'd taken her own life. Rebecca's hand moved unconsciously to cover his. "I'm so sorry." He turned his palm up, his fingers curling around hers. When I saw you on that auction block, I made a promise to myself that history wouldn't repeat itself. Not if I could prevent it. The warmth of his hand around hers sent a tremor through Rebecca that had nothing to do with sympathy. Then, I'm doubly grateful. You saved more than just my freedom that day. Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment Rebecca thought he might lean closer. Instead, he gently squeezed her hand before releasing it. I should let you get back to work, he said, rising to his feet and offering his hand to help her up. Mrs. Abernathy seems like the understanding sort, but I wouldn't want to take advantage. Rebecca gathered her shawl, oddly disappointed. Will I see you again, Mr. Blackwood? He settled his hat back on his head, the brim casting shadows across his face. I believe you will, Miss Sinclair. In fact, I'd like to call on you properly if you'd permit it. Joy bubbled up inside her. I would like that very much. As they walked back toward town, their hands occasionally brushing, Rebecca felt a sense of possibility she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. Daniel Blackwood was still largely a mystery to her, but one she found herself increasingly eager to solve. Little did she know that danger was riding hard towards Silver Creek danger that would test their newfound connection and force them both to confront the shadows of their pasts. 3 days after their lunch by the creek, Daniel Blackwood called on Rebecca at the boarding house. Mrs. Cooper answered his knock with a knowing smile and ushered him into the small parlor where Rebecca waited, her heart fluttering with anticipation. He looked different today, freshly shaved, his dark hair neatly combed, wearing a clean shirt and vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. The only familiar elements were his worn boots and the gun belt at his hip, which Rebecca suspected he never removed while awake. You look lovely, he said, his eyes taking in her blue dress, one she had made herself from remnants at the shop, Mrs. Abernathy having generously allowed her to use the scraps. Thank you, Rebecca replied, smoothing the skirt nervously. I hope you don't mind a simple evening, Mrs. Cooper has prepared supper for us. Nothing would please me more, he assured her, offering his arm to escort her to the dining room. Mrs. Cooper had outdone herself, preparing a roast chicken with vegetables and fresh bread. She served them with a flourish before tactfully withdrawing to give them privacy. Though Rebecca noticed the older woman leaving the connecting door slightly ajar, propriety demanded at least the appearance of chaperoning. As they ate, conversation flowed more easily than Rebecca had expected. Daniel told her of his travels through the territories, describing magnificent landscapes and frontier towns with such vivid detail that she could almost see them herself. You've lived quite an adventurous life, Rebecca commented, fascinated by his tales. Have you never thought of settling in one place? A shadow crossed his face. I tried once. After the war, I bought land in Kansas, built a cabin with my own hands, planted crops. Something in his tone made Rebecca's heart ache. What happened? Drought took the crops, fever took my wife. His words were simple but laden with old grief. Sarah was a schoolteacher. We were married less than a year. Rebecca's hand moved instinctively to cover his. I'm so sorry, Daniel. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the intimacy of it hung in the air between them. His fingers turned beneath hers, clasping them gently. It was a long time ago, he said softly. I've been wandering ever since. The life of a hired gun isn't one I'd have chosen, but it suits a man with few attachments. And yet you've shown more compassion than most men with deep roots and respectable professions, Rebecca observed. His thumb traced small circles on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. What about you, Rebecca? What dreams did you have before? Before I was tied to an auction block. She finished when he hesitated. It's all right, we needn't dance around it. She withdrew her hand, suddenly needing the distance to think clearly. I had simple dreams, to marry someone kind, to have children, to continue helping in my father's store. Your father was a merchant. Rebecca nodded. He owned the general store. After Mother died when I was 12, I became his assistant. I learned bookkeeping, ordering, everything needed to run the business. A bitter laugh escaped her, or so I thought. Clearly, I missed something important or we wouldn't have been in such debt. Daniel studied her face. It wasn't your responsibility to prevent his financial troubles. Wasn't it? I kept the books. I should have seen the signs. From what I hear in town, your father was deliberately hiding his situation from you, Daniel said gently. The debt collector Finch had been pressuring him for years, calling in loans that may not have been entirely legitimate. Rebecca's eyes widened. You've been asking about my father. I like to understand situations fully, he admitted without apology. Several townspeople believe Finch falsified at least some of the debt claims. Unfortunately, with your father gone and the papers bearing his signature real or forged, there's little legal recourse. The injustice of it burned in Rebecca's chest. So Finch not only took our home and business, but had me publicly humiliated and sold like cattle, all based on potentially fraudulent claims. It appears so, Daniel confirmed, his expression hardening. Men like Finch operate in the shadows between legality and crime. They're often more dangerous than outright outlaws because they wear a veneer of respectability. Rebecca pushed her plate away, appetite gone. I've been so focused on rebuilding my life that I haven't allowed myself to question the justice of what happened. That's understandable, Daniel assured her. Survival comes first. But now, she looked up at him, a new determination kindling within her. Should I not seek some form of justice? Daniel's eyes held a warning. Be careful, Rebecca. Finch is well connected in this town. Challenging him could be dangerous. More dangerous than being sold at auction, she countered with unexpected fire. A smile touched his lips, admiration clear in his eyes. You're braver than you give yourself credit for. Their conversation shifted to lighter topics as Mrs. Cooper served apple pie for dessert, but the seed had been planted in Rebecca's mind. If Finch had indeed fabricated or inflated her father's debts, shouldn't that truth come to light? After dinner, Daniel escorted Rebecca to the porch swing. The evening air was cool but pleasant, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. They sat close enough that Rebecca could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Thank you for a lovely evening, he said, his deep voice soft in the gathering dusk. Will you be staying in town much longer? Rebecca asked, trying to keep the hope from her voice. Daniel turned slightly to face her, his knee brushing against her skirt. I've taken a room at the hotel for now. I find myself reluctant to leave Silver Creek just yet. His gaze dropped briefly to her lips before meeting her eyes again, and Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Daniel leaned closer. His hand came up to gently cup her cheek, rough fingers surprisingly tender against her skin. May I? He whispered, his face inches from hers. Rebecca answered by closing the distance herself, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened as his arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. His mouth was warm and tasted faintly of apple pie, his stubble rough against her skin in a way that sent delicious shivers down her spine. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Rebecca felt as though the world had shifted beneath her feet. She had been kissed before chaste pecks from suitors her father had approved, but nothing like this. Nothing that made her feel as though she might float away if Daniel's strong arm weren't anchoring her to the porch swing. I should go, he said, his voice rougher than before. Before Mrs. Cooper feels obliged to come chaperone more directly. Rebecca laughed softly, reluctantly pulling back. Will I see you tomorrow? Count on it, he promised, rising and settling his hat on his head. He took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Sweet dreams, Rebecca. She watched him walk away, his tall figure soon swallowed by the darkness. Only when he had disappeared from view did Rebecca touch her fingers to her lips, still tingling from his kiss. Inside, Mrs. Cooper waited with a cup of tea and a knowing expression that made Rebecca blush to the roots of her hair. That man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars, the older woman observed, passing Rebecca the teacup. It's too soon to be thinking such things, Rebecca protested weakly. Mrs. Cooper snorted. Nonsense. Sometimes the heart knows in an instant what the head takes weeks to figure out. She patted Rebecca's hand. Just be careful, dear. Daniel Blackwood is a good man from all accounts, but he carries shadows with him, and I'm not just talking about his lost wife. What do you mean? Men in his line of work make enemies, Mrs. Cooper said simply. And those enemies have a way of finding them eventually, no matter how far they run. The warning cast a pall over Rebecca's happiness, reminding her that the man who had begun to capture her heart was also a man who wore a gun for reasons beyond mere decoration. What dangers might follow Daniel Blackwood to Silver Creek? And would those dangers threaten the fragile new beginning Rebecca had found? These questions troubled her dreams that night, mingling with memories of Daniel's kiss and the comforting strength of his arms around her. The following morning brought rain a steady, soaking downpour that drummed on the roof of the dress shop and kept customers away. Rebecca used the quiet hours to work on a special order for the banker's wife, a fancy dinner dress in emerald green silk that required intricate beadwork along the bodice. Mrs. Abernathy had gone home at noon, complaining that the damp made her joints ache, leaving Rebecca alone in the shop. The steady rhythm of needle and thread was soothing, allowing her mind to wander to thoughts of Daniel and their dinner the previous evening. The memory of his kiss made her fingers falter, pricking herself with the needle. "Careful there," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Rebecca looked up, her heart leaping at the sight of Daniel standing just inside the shop, water dripping from his duster and hat. She hadn't even heard the bell above the door over the sound of the rain. "You're soaked through," she exclaimed, setting aside her work and hurrying to take his wet coat. "It's coming down like Noah's flood out there," he agreed, removing his hat and shaking off the excess water. "I thought you might like some company since business must be slow today." Rebecca hung his coat near the stove to dry. "Mrs. Abernathy left early, so it's just me. I'm afraid I can't offer much entertainment beyond watching me sew." Daniel settled into a chair near her work table, stretching his long legs before him. "I'd be content just to watch you breathe, Rebecca." The simple statement, delivered in his matter-of-fact tone, brought heat to her cheeks. No one had ever spoken to her with such open admiration. "You'll make me prick my finger again with talk like that," she warned, trying to sound stern despite the smile tugging at her lips. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then perhaps I should save such talk for when you're not holding sharp objects." Rebecca laughed, the sound brightening the gray day. "Perhaps you should. Now tell me, what brings you out in such weather besides a desire to watch a seamstress at work?" Daniel's expression grew more serious. "I've been making inquiries about Finch and your father's debts." Rebecca set down her needle entirely now, giving him her full attention. "And I spoke with the bank manager this morning. He confirmed that your father had a loan with the bank, but it was much smaller than what Finch claimed was owed. More importantly, your father had been making regular payments." Hope flared in Rebecca's chest. So Finch was lying, at the very least exaggerating considerably, Daniel confirmed. "I also spoke with 3 merchants who were listed on Finch's debt claims. 2 said they had extended credit to your father, but that he had settled his accounts before his death. The 3rd Willard at the lumber yard admitted that Finch had approached him about signing a statement claiming your father owed money, even though he didn't." Rebecca's hands trembled. "Why would Mr. Willard do such a thing?" "Finch holds the mortgage on the lumber yard. He threatened to call in the loan if Willard didn't cooperate." Daniel's jaw tightened. "It seems our debt collector has been playing this game for some time, using his position to manipulate and threaten people. Can anything be done? Legally, I mean." Daniel ran a hand through his damp hair. "That's trickier. The sheriff here seems reluctant to cross Finch. The territorial judge won't be through for another month at least, but if enough people were willing to testify about Finch's methods." "They're afraid," Rebecca said with sudden understanding. "Just like Mr. Willard." "Yes. Finch has carefully built a web of financial control over this town. Breaking free of it won't be easy." Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her face. It might be simpler for you to leave Silver Creek, start fresh somewhere else. The suggestion caught Rebecca off guard. Leave. But I've just begun to rebuild my life here. You could rebuild elsewhere, Daniel pointed out. Denver, perhaps, or further east. An uncomfortable thought occurred to her. Are you suggesting I leave because you plan to move on soon? Daniel's eyes widened slightly. No, that's not, he broke off, standing abruptly to pace the small shop. I'm concerned about your safety, Rebecca. If Finch realizes I'm investigating him, he might retaliate against you. I won't be driven from my hometown by a man like Jacob Finch, Rebecca declared, her chin lifting with determination. This is where I was born, where my parents are buried. I won't let him take that from me too. Daniel stopped pacing to look at her, an unreadable expression in his blue eyes. You're quite remarkable, you know that. Before Rebecca could respond, the shop door burst open, admitting a breathless young boy of about 12, soaked to the skin. Mr. Blackwood, the boy gasped. You gotta come quick. There's trouble at the saloon, men asking for you. They got guns. Daniel's hand moved instinctively to his holster. Who are they, Tommy? Don't know their names, sir. 3 of them, mean-looking, said they heard Daniel Blackwood was in town and they've got an old score to settle. The boy glanced nervously at Rebecca. They said they'd start shooting folks if you didn't show up soon. Daniel's expression hardened into something Rebecca hadn't seen before: cold, dangerous, the face of a man who had faced death many times and dealt it out in equal measure. Get somewhere safe, Tommy. Then find the sheriff, though I doubt he'll be much help. Daniel turned to Rebecca, his voice gentler but urgent. Stay here. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but Mrs. Cooper or Mrs. Abernathy. Daniel, no, Rebecca protested, fear clutching at her heart. 3 against 1, those aren't odds anyone should face. He cupped her face in his hands. This is what I do, Rebecca, and I won't let innocent people get hurt because someone's looking for me. He pressed a swift, hard kiss to her lips. Lock the door. Before she could argue further, he was gone, striding into the rain with purpose in every line of his body. Rebecca rushed to the door, securing it as he'd instructed, then moved to the window to watch his tall figure disappear in the direction of the saloon. Mrs. Cooper's warning echoed in her mind. Men in his line of work make enemies, and those enemies have a way of finding them eventually. Rebecca pressed a hand to her mouth, fear and helplessness washing over her. She had only just found Daniel Blackwood. The thought of losing him now was unbearable. But Daniel had made his choice, walking deliberately toward danger to protect a town that wasn't even his home. All Rebecca could do was wait, and pray that the man who had saved her would somehow save himself as well. Through the rain-streaked window, Rebecca watched Daniel's figure disappear down the muddy street toward the saloon. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she considered his instructions to stay safely locked in the shop. Every instinct urged her to follow him, to somehow help, but she knew she would only be a distraction, perhaps a fatal one, if she appeared in the middle of a confrontation. Instead, she paced the small shop, stopping occasionally to peer through the window at the empty street. The rain continued its relentless drumming, obscuring visibility and muffling sounds. She strained her ears for gunshots, but heard nothing beyond the downpour. 20 minutes passed like 20 hours. Rebecca had just decided she couldn't bear the suspense any longer when the shop door rattled with a forceful knock. "Rebecca, are you in there? It's Mrs. Cooper." Relief flooded through her as she hastened to unlock the door. The older woman bustled in, shaking rain from her umbrella. "What's happening?" Rebecca demanded. "Is Daniel? He's alive," Mrs. Cooper assured her quickly. "But there's been shooting at the saloon. I came to bring you back to the boarding house. It's not safe for you to be alone right now." Rebecca grabbed her shawl, not bothering with an umbrella. "Tell me everything as we walk." They hurried through the rain, Mrs. Cooper keeping a firm grip on Rebecca's arm. 3 men rode into town looking for Blackwood. They found him at the saloon, or rather, he found them. I don't know exactly what happened inside, but there was shouting, then gunfire. 2 of the strangers are dead, the 3rd is wounded. Blackwood took a bullet to the shoulder, but he's on his feet. Where is he now? Rebecca asked, her throat tight with fear. Doc Sullivan's treating him at the clinic. The sheriff's there too, trying to sort out what happened, Mrs. Cooper gave Rebecca a pointed look. This is exactly the sort of trouble I warned might follow him. They reached the boarding house, but Rebecca stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. I need to go to him. Rebecca, that's not proper. I don't care about proper, Rebecca interrupted, a fierceness in her voice that surprised them both. He faced those men to protect this town, to protect me. I won't let him face the aftermath alone. Mrs. Cooper studied her face for a long moment before sighing in resignation. At least let me come with you as chaperone. There's been enough scandal surrounding your name lately. Together, they made their way to the small building that served as both doctor's office and clinic. Inside, they found the sheriff, a portly man named Billings, who was known to spend more time at the saloon than enforcing the law, questioning Daniel, who sat shirtless on an examination table while Doc Sullivan bandaged his left shoulder. Daniel's eyes found Rebecca immediately, widening in surprise and then softening with something that made her heart skip. You shouldn't be here, he said, though his expression belied his words. Clearly I should, Rebecca countered, taking in his injury with concern. The white bandage was already showing spots of red where blood seeped through. How badly are you hurt? Just a graze, Doc Sullivan answered for him. Though just is a relative term when we're talking about bullet wounds. He'll need to keep that arm immobile for at least a week. Sheriff Billings cleared his throat loudly. As I was saying before the ladies interrupted, I need to know why 3 armed men rode into my town looking for you, Blackwood. Daniel's expression remained impassive. As I told you, they were members of the Carson gang. I brought in their leader last year in Wyoming Territory. He's serving 20 years in territorial prison for murder and robbery. These 3 decided to seek revenge. And now 2 of them are dead, and the 3rd is likely to hang once he recovers enough to stand trial, Billings said with obvious displeasure. That's a lot of blood spilled in my town. Would you prefer they had shot up the saloon and killed innocent people? Daniel asked coolly. Because that was their stated intention if I didn't face them, the sheriff's face reddened. I'd prefer dangerous men like you take your troubles elsewhere. That's enough, Sheriff, Mrs. Cooper interrupted, stepping forward. Mr. Blackwood protected this town today at great personal risk. You might consider thanking him rather than berating him. Several other townspeople who had gathered in the clinic murmured in agreement. Billings looked around at the unsympathetic faces and adjusted his approach. Be that as it may, he continued with less hostility. It might be best for all concerned if you moved on soon, Blackwood. No offense intended. None taken, Daniel replied evenly. But I have unfinished business in Silver Creek. I'll be staying until it's concluded. His eyes met Rebecca's as he spoke, and the intensity of his gaze left little doubt about at least part of that unfinished business. Heat rose to her cheeks even as worry gnawed at her heart. How many more enemies might come looking for him? And what of his investigation into Finch's dealings? Doc Sullivan finished securing the bandage and handed Daniel a clean shirt. You're lucky, Blackwood. An inch to the right and we'd be having a very different conversation. Take it easy for a few days. Daniel nodded his thanks as he carefully pulled on the shirt, wincing slightly as he moved his injured arm. Rebecca stepped forward instinctively to help him with the buttons, her fingers brushing against his chest as she worked. Even in these circumstances, the contact sent a thrill through her. Thank you, he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Mr. Blackwood will need proper care for that wound, Mrs. Cooper announced to the room at large. As my boarding house has the cleanest rooms in town, I insist he stay with us until he's recovered. Sheriff Billings frowned. Mrs. Cooper, considering your current boarder, that hardly seems. I have 3 empty rooms, Sheriff. The widow cut him off sharply. Mr. Blackwood will occupy one at the opposite end of the hall from Miss Sinclair with my room between them, unless you're suggesting my chaperoning is inadequate. The sheriff backed down in the face of Mrs. Cooper's formidable glare. "No, madam, I'm sure that will be suitable." With that settled, Rebecca and Mrs. Cooper helped Daniel back to the boarding house through the continuing rain. He insisted he could walk unaided, but Rebecca noticed the pallor beneath his tan and the tightness around his eyes that spoke of pain he was trying to conceal. At the boarding house, Mrs. Cooper showed him to a small but comfortable room on the ground floor. "This will be easier than navigating stairs with that shoulder," she explained. "I'll bring up some broth shortly. You need to keep your strength up." When the older woman left to prepare the promised meal, Rebecca lingered in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. Daniel sat heavily on the edge of the bed, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "You should rest," she said softly. He looked up at her, a wry smile touching his lips. "I've had worse days." "That doesn't exactly reassure me." Rebecca stepped into the room, leaving the door open for propriety's sake. "Those men came here because of you. Who else might follow?" Daniel sighed, running his good hand through his hair. "The Carson gang was the worst of my unfinished business. There might be others with grudges, but none likely to track me this far east." "You're certain?" "As certain as anyone in my line of work can be." He reached for her hand, drawing her closer. "Rebecca, I understand if this changes how you feel. A man like me brings complications that a woman like you shouldn't have to face." Rebecca studied his face, the strong lines, the weariness, the shadows of old pain in his eyes. In the week since he'd freed her from the auction block, Daniel Blackwood had come to mean more to her than she had thought possible. The idea of walking away from whatever was growing between them felt like contemplating another kind of bondage, a prison of safety and convention that would leave her forever wondering what might have been. "I'm not afraid of complications," she said at last, squeezing his hand. "I'm afraid of losing you just when I've found you." The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than she had intended. Daniel's eyes darkened as he tugged gently on her hand, pulling her down to sit beside him on the bed. "Rebecca," he began, his voice rough with emotion, but whatever he meant to say was interrupted by Mrs. Cooper's return with a tray of food. The older woman raised an eyebrow at their position, but made no comment as she set down the tray. "Eat while it's hot, Mr. Blackwood." "Rebecca, I could use your help in the kitchen." With one last lingering look at Daniel, Rebecca followed her landlady from the room, aware that their conversation and whatever might have followed it would have to wait for another time. That evening, after a quiet dinner during which Mrs. Cooper maintained a flow of determinedly normal conversation, Rebecca retired to her room. She sat by the window, watching the rain that continued to fall, wondering what Daniel was thinking in his room below. A soft knock at her door roused her from her reverie. She opened it to find Mrs. Cooper holding a steaming cup of tea. "I thought you might have trouble sleeping," the older woman said, handing her the cup. "It's chamomile with a touch of honey." "Thank you." Rebecca accepted the tea gratefully, stepping back to allow Mrs. Cooper to enter. The widow settled herself in the room's single chair, regarding Rebecca with knowing eyes. "You care for him deeply already, don't you?" There seemed little point in denial. "Yes, it's happened so quickly, but yes." Mrs. Cooper nodded slowly. "I thought as much. And he clearly feels the same for you. I haven't seen a man look at a woman the way he looks at you since my Harold was alive." "But you have concerns," Rebecca guessed, sipping her tea. "Naturally. Not about the man himself. From all I've seen and heard, Daniel Blackwood is honorable to his core. But his life, that's another matter entirely." Mrs. Cooper leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Rebecca, a man who makes his living with a gun is a man who lives with death as a constant companion. Can you accept that?" The question struck at the heart of Rebecca's own fears. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I do know that walking away from him now would be walking away from something precious, something rare." Mrs. Cooper's eyes softened. "Love often finds us at the most inconvenient times with the most complicated people." She rose from her chair, patting Rebecca's hand. "Just be sure of your heart before you give it completely. And remember that sometimes loving someone means being willing to let them go. With those unsettling words, Mrs. Cooper left Rebecca alone with her thoughts and her cooling tea. Meanwhile, in his room below, Daniel Blackwood stared at the ceiling, his injured shoulder throbbing despite the laudanum Doc Sullivan had prescribed. The pain was familiar. He had been shot before, cut, beaten, and broken in his years as a scout, and later as a manhunter. Physical discomfort was an old companion. What was unfamiliar was the ache in his chest when he thought of Rebecca Sinclair and the fear in her eyes when she had seen his wound. He had grown accustomed to facing danger alone, to moving on when trouble found him, to leaving nothing and no one behind that might tie him to one place. But now, for the first time since Sarah's death, he found himself contemplating a different kind of life, one with roots. One where he might wake each morning to Rebecca's smile, fall asleep each night with her in his arms. It was a dangerous dream for a man like him. The events at the saloon had proven that. His past had a way of finding him, no matter how far he rode. And yet, as sleep finally claimed him, Daniel's last conscious thought was not of danger or death, but of Rebecca's soft declaration. "I'm not afraid of complications. I'm afraid of losing you just when I've found you." Perhaps, he thought as darkness enveloped him, it was time to consider leaving behind the life that had defined him for so long. Perhaps, with Rebecca, he might find a new definition of who Daniel Blackwood could be. The following morning broke clear and bright, the rain having washed away the dust and leaving the world feeling renewed. Rebecca woke early, dressing with extra care in a pale yellow dress that Mrs. Abernathy had insisted she take as payment for overtime work. When she entered the kitchen, she found Daniel already seated at the table, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked better than he had the previous day, still pale, but with more color in his face and less strain around his eyes. "Good morning," she said, suddenly shy in the bright light of day. Their conversation in his room had veered dangerously close to declarations neither of them might be ready to make. Daniel's face softened as he looked at her. "Good morning. You look lovely." Mrs. Cooper bustled in from the pantry carrying a basket of eggs. "Ah, Rebecca, you're up. Good. I need to run to the mercantile before breakfast. Would you mind watching these eggs don't burn while I'm gone, and make sure Mr. Blackwood doesn't try to use that injured arm?" Before either of them could respond, the widow had donned her shawl and hurried out the door, leaving them alone in the warm kitchen. Rebecca strongly suspected the errand was a pretext to give them privacy, a thought confirmed by the knowing look Mrs. Cooper had flashed her on the way out. "She's not subtle, is she?" Daniel commented with a hint of amusement. Rebecca laughed as she moved to the stove to tend the eggs. "Mrs. Cooper believes in helping fate along when she can." A comfortable silence fell as Rebecca prepared breakfast, aware of Daniel's eyes following her movements. When she finally set plates of eggs and toast before them and took her seat, he reached across the table to capture her hand. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he began, his thumb tracing circles on her palm in a way that made it difficult to concentrate. "About being afraid of losing me," Rebecca's heart quickened. And I've realized I'm afraid of the same thing." His blue eyes held her steadily. "Rebecca, I came to Silver Creek tracking a fugitive, but I stayed because of you. These past days, they've meant more to me than I can express." Hope blossomed in Rebecca's chest. "They've meant a great deal to me as well." Daniel's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I need to be honest with you. My life has been violent. I've killed men not just yesterday, but many times before. Always in self-defense or in the execution of my duty, but that doesn't wash the blood away." His expression grew grave. "You deserve to know exactly who I am before whatever is growing between us goes any further." Rebecca studied their joined hands, considering his words. "We all have pasts, Daniel. What matters to me is the man you are now, the man who spent a fortune to free a stranger from humiliation and bondage. The man who investigates injustice simply because it is unjust. The man who faced 3 gunmen to protect a town that isn't even his home. That man still wears a gun, Daniel reminded her gently, and likely always will. Then I'll learn to live with that, Rebecca said with simple conviction, if that's what you want. Daniel rose from his chair, still holding her hand, and drew her to her feet. With his good arm, he pulled her against his chest, his eyes searching her face. What I want, he said softly, is to build something lasting with you, Rebecca Sinclair, if you'll have me. Rebecca's heart soared at his words. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Daniel Blackwood? A smile curved his lips. I'm asking if you might consider a future with a battered old gunman who finds himself unexpectedly, completely in love with the bravest woman he's ever met. Love, Rebecca whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Love, Daniel confirmed, bending to brush his lips against hers. I didn't come to Silver Creek looking for it, but I found it nonetheless, on an auction block of all places. Rebecca's arms slipped around his neck as she returned his kiss with all the emotion welling in her heart. Then my answer is yes, she murmured against his lips. Yes to everything you're asking and everything you're not. Their kiss deepened, the world narrowing to just the two of them in the sunlit kitchen until the front door opened and Mrs. Cooper's voice called out a deliberately loud warning of her return. They broke apart, Rebecca blushing furiously while Daniel looked more amused than embarrassed. When Mrs. Cooper entered the kitchen, she took one look at their flushed faces and clasped her hands in delight. Well, it seems my errand was perfectly timed, she declared. Am I to offer congratulations? Daniel's arm remained around Rebecca's waist as he nodded. If Rebecca will have me as her husband, then yes, congratulations would be in order. Of course she'll have you, Mrs. Cooper said confidently. Anyone with eyes can see you're meant for each other. She bustled to the cupboard and retrieved a bottle of blackberry cordial she reserved for special occasions. This calls for a toast, as Mrs. Cooper poured the sweet liquid into 3 small glasses. Rebecca leaned into Daniel's embrace, marveling at how quickly life could change. Just over a week ago, she had stood humiliated on an auction block, certain her life was over. Now she stood in the arms of a man who loved her, planning a future brighter than any she could have imagined. The toast was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Mrs. Cooper frowned as she set down her glass. Who could that be at this hour? She went to answer, returning moments later with a grim expression. It's Sheriff Billings. He wants to speak with both of you. The sheriff entered the kitchen, hat in hand but with no warmth in his expression. Miss Sinclair, Mr. Blackwood, I'm afraid I have some troubling news. Rebecca felt Daniel tense beside her. What is it, Sheriff? Billings shifted uncomfortably. Jacob Finch was found dead in his office this morning, shot through the heart. Rebecca gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. How terrible, when did this happen? Sometime during the night, best we can tell, and… The sheriff hesitated, his eyes moving to Daniel. And there's reason to believe you might be involved, Blackwood. Daniel's expression hardened. What reason would that be? You were seen asking questions about Finch yesterday. Several people heard you accusing him of fraud regarding Miss Sinclair's father's debts, and Finch's clerk says he saw you arguing with him late yesterday afternoon. I did speak with Finch, Daniel acknowledged calmly. I presented him with evidence that he had falsified debt claims against George Sinclair. I suggested he might want to make restitution to Miss Sinclair before the territorial judge arrived next month. He was very much alive when I left his office. Can anyone verify when you returned to the boarding house? Billings pressed. Mrs. Cooper stepped forward. I can. Mr. Blackwood returned directly after visiting Dr. Sullivan for his wound. He did not leave the house again all night. I would have heard him, as my room is nearest the stairs and front door. The sheriff looked unconvinced. Be that as it may, I'm going to need you to come down to the jail, Blackwood, just to answer some questions officially. This is absurd, Rebecca protested. Daniel was wounded yesterday. He could barely walk, let alone go out in the middle of the night to commit murder. It's all right, Rebecca, Daniel said, squeezing her hand reassuringly. I have nothing to hide. I'll go with the sheriff and clear this up. He turned to Billings. I assume I'm not under arrest. Not at present, the sheriff conceded. But don't leave town. I have no intention of leaving, Daniel stated firmly, his eyes meeting Rebecca's with a promise that warmed her despite her worry. I have important reasons to stay in Silver Creek. As Daniel left with the sheriff, Rebecca turned to Mrs. Cooper, fear clutching at her heart. They can't possibly believe Daniel killed Finch. It's ridiculous. Of course it is, Mrs. Cooper agreed, patting her arm. But Daniel Blackwood is a convenient suspect, a stranger with a gun and a known history of violence, who had a confrontation with the victim on the same day as the murder. But you told the sheriff he was here all night. And he was, Mrs. Cooper confirmed. I may have been asleep, but I'm a light sleeper. No one left this house after dark. She frowned thoughtfully. The question is, if not Daniel, then who killed Jacob Finch, and why now? Rebecca's mind raced, considering the implications. Finch had enemies, many of them, if Daniel's investigations were accurate. People the debt collector had threatened, cheated, manipulated, any one of them might have had reason to want him dead. I need to help Daniel, she decided, reaching for her shawl. I'll go to the jail, Mrs. Cooper nodded approvingly. Yes, but first, let's think about who might have actually committed this murder. The sheriff is looking for the easiest solution, not necessarily the correct one. Together, they sat at the kitchen table, making a list of people who might have had both motive and opportunity to kill Jacob Finch. By the time they finished, Rebecca had a clear sense of where to start her own investigation. Be careful, Mrs. Cooper cautioned as Rebecca prepared to leave. Whoever killed Finch might not appreciate your questions. Rebecca squared her shoulders, determination replacing fear. Daniel risked his life to save me from the auction block. He's been working to clear my father's name. I won't stand by while he's falsely accused of murder. With that, she set out into the bright morning, her mind focused on one goal, proving Daniel's innocence, no matter what it took. Rebecca's first stop was the jail, a small brick building near the center of town. Inside, she found Sheriff Billings seated at his desk while Daniel sat calmly in a chair across from him, his injured arm in a sling but his posture relaxed and confident. Both men looked up in surprise when she entered. Daniel's expression immediately softened while the sheriff frowned in disapproval. Miss Sinclair, this is an official investigation. I'm going to have to ask you to. I understand you're doing your job, Sheriff, Rebecca interrupted, summoning the poise she'd learned from years of working in her father's store. But I have information that may be relevant to your investigation. This caught Billings' attention. What information? Rebecca glanced at Daniel, who gave her an encouraging nod. As Mr. Blackwood discovered yesterday, Jacob Finch had been systematically defrauding multiple people in this town, including my late father. Mr. Blackwood wasn't the only person who confronted Finch about his dishonest dealings. Go on, the sheriff said, leaning forward with reluctant interest. Willard from the lumber yard admitted to Mr. Blackwood that Finch had forced him to sign a false statement about my father's debts. And according to Mrs. Cooper, Finch held mortgages on at least 5 businesses in town, using those debts as leverage to manipulate the owners. Billings sighed heavily. Miss Sinclair, I'm well aware that Finch wasn't the most beloved man in Silver Creek. But that doesn't change the fact that Blackwood here had a confrontation with him the very day he was killed. A confrontation witnessed by Finch's clerk, Daniel pointed out calmly. Who can verify that I left Finch very much alive? The clerk, Abel Morton, is exactly who I intend to speak with next, Rebecca declared. If I may, Sheriff, I'd like to ask some questions around town. Perhaps someone saw something unusual near Finch's office last night. The sheriff regarded her with a mixture of irritation and grudging respect. I suppose I can't stop you from talking to people. Just don't interfere with an official investigation. Rebecca turned to Daniel, her eyes conveying what she couldn't say in front of the sheriff. He seemed to understand, giving her a slight smile. Be careful, he murmured as she prepared to leave. Whoever killed Finch is still out there. I will, she promised, and I'll be back soon. Rebecca's next stop was Finch's office, where she found Abel Morton, a thin, nervous man in his 30s, sorting through papers under the watchful eye of a deputy. "Miss Sinclair," Morton greeted her, seeming relieved to see a friendly face. "Terrible business, this." "Indeed," Rebecca agreed, lowering her voice. "Mr. Morton, might I have a word with you? About yesterday afternoon." The clerk glanced at the deputy, who had wandered to the window and wasn't paying them much attention. "What about it? You saw Mr. Blackwood speak with Mr. Finch, didn't you?" Rebecca asked. Morton nodded. "He came in around 4 o'clock. There was some heated discussion. I couldn't hear all of it, but Mr. Blackwood was accusing Mr. Finch of fraud regarding your father's debts." "And what time did Mr. Blackwood leave?" "Just before 5, Mr. Finch was quite agitated afterward, but very much alive." Morton hesitated, then added in a whisper, "There was another visitor later, though, after I left for the day." Rebecca's heart quickened. "How do you know?" "I forgot my spectacles and came back around 7. Mr. Finch was meeting with Horace Wilkins from the saloon. They were arguing something fierce. I didn't want to interrupt, so I left without my glasses." "Horace Wilkins," Rebecca repeated, remembering the saloon owner who had bid on her at the auction. "Did you tell the sheriff about this?" Morton looked uncomfortable. "He hasn't asked me yet, and Wilkins, he's not someone I'm eager to cross." "Thank you, Mr. Morton. You've been very helpful." Rebecca left the office with a new lead to pursue. Horace Wilkins had been one of the most aggressive bidders at the auction before Daniel intervened. Could there be a connection? The Silver Creek Saloon was doing brisk business despite the early hour. Rebecca hesitated at the entrance, knowing that a respectable woman would never enter such an establishment alone. But these were extraordinary circumstances, and she was already the subject of town gossip thanks to the auction. What more damage could be done to her reputation? Squaring her shoulders, she pushed through the swinging doors. The room fell silent as heads turned in her direction. She spotted Wilkins behind the bar, his piggy eyes widening in surprise at her appearance. "Miss Sinclair," he said, recovering quickly, "this is no place for a lady." "I need to speak with you, Mr. Wilkins," Rebecca stated firmly, approaching the bar with more confidence than she felt. "In private, if possible." Curiosity overcame his initial resistance. Wilkins gestured to a door behind the bar. "My office. 5 minutes." The office was small and reeked of cigar smoke. Wilkins closed the door and turned to face her, arms crossed over his substantial belly. "What's this about?" Rebecca decided directness was her best approach. "I understand you met with Jacob Finch last night around 7 o'clock. Wilkins' expression darkened. "Who told you that?" "Someone who saw you there," Rebecca replied, deliberately vague. "Mr. Wilkins, the sheriff is currently questioning Daniel Blackwood about Finch's murder. If you know anything that might help clear him, that gunslinger's problems ain't my concern," Wilkins interrupted. "Yeah, I saw Finch last night. Business matter. He was alive when I left." "What was this business matter?" Rebecca pressed. Wilkins scowled. "That's private." "But if you must know, Finch held the mortgage on this building. He was raising my interest rate for the 3rd time this year, claimed the bank required it, but we both knew that was horseshit, pardon my language." "So you argued with him, wouldn't you?" Wilkins countered. "Man was bleeding me dry, same as half the town." He studied her face, his expression calculating. "You think I killed him, don't you?" Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "I think someone did, Mr. Wilkins, someone who had reason to want him dead, and I think it wasn't Daniel Blackwood." Wilkins surprised her by laughing, a harsh sound without humor. "Well, you got one thing right. It wasn't your gunslinger. I left Finch's office about 8. He was meeting someone else after me, looked nervous about it too." Rebecca's pulse quickened. "Did you see who?" "Nope. But Finch mentioned the bank manager was coming by with some papers that couldn't wait till morning." Wilkins leaned forward, his breath reeking of whiskey. "Now, unless you're interested in other business, Miss Sinclair, I've got a saloon to run." Rebecca thanked him and left quickly, her mind processing this new information. The bank manager, Edward Harrington, had been on the list she and Mrs. Cooper had compiled that morning. But why would he meet Finch after hours, and with what papers? The bank was her next destination. Inside, she found Harrington, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers, working at his desk. "Miss Sinclair," he greeted her with a tight smile. "What can the Silver Creek Bank do for you today?" Rebecca took a seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Mr. Harrington, I understand you met with Jacob Finch last night." The banker's face paled visibly. "Who told you that? Is it true?" Rebecca countered. Harrington's hands fidgeted with his pen. "Yes, I did see Finch briefly. Bank business confidential. Mr. Harrington, Daniel Blackwood is being questioned about Finch's murder. If you have information that could help establish who really killed him." "I didn't kill him," Harrington blurted, his voice rising in panic. "Yes, I went to his office around 8:30 with some papers he needed to sign. He was alive when I left at 9. That's all I know." Rebecca studied the banker's face, noting the sheen of sweat on his brow despite the mild temperature. "What papers were these?" Harrington hesitated, then seemed to deflate. "Transfer documents. Finch was selling his debt collection business and all the notes he held to a businessman from Denver. The papers needed his signature before the buyer arrived today." "And who is this buyer?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "A man named Carson. Richard Carson. He's due on the afternoon stage." Rebecca's blood ran cold. Carson, the same name as the gang whose leader Daniel had brought to justice in Wyoming. The gang whose surviving members had tracked Daniel to Silver Creek seeking revenge. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington," she said, rising quickly. "You've been most helpful." She hurried from the bank, her mind racing. If Richard Carson was related to the outlaw Daniel had captured, perhaps a brother or father than Finch's murder, and the attack on Daniel might be connected. But how? And why would Carson be buying Finch's business? The pieces began to fall into place as she hurried back toward the jail. Carson wanted revenge on Daniel. What better way than to gain control over the town where Daniel had found someone worth staying for? By purchasing Finch's debt collection business, Carson would effectively own half of Silver Creek, including the mortgage on Mrs. Cooper's boarding house where Rebecca lived. She burst into the sheriff's office, breathless from her run. "Sheriff Billings, I know who killed Jacob Finch." Both the sheriff and Daniel looked up in surprise. Daniel rose to his feet, concern evident in his expression. "Rebecca, what's happened?" "It's connected to the Carson gang," she explained quickly. "The men who attacked you yesterday weren't just seeking revenge for their leader's capture. They were the advance party for Richard Carson, who's arriving on today's stage to purchase Finch's debt collection business." Sheriff Billings frowned. "What are you talking about, Miss Sinclair?" Mr. Harrington confirmed he met with Finch last night to have transfer documents signed. Finch was selling his entire business to Richard Carson from Denver. She turned to Daniel. "Is that name familiar to you?" Daniel's expression had darkened. "James Carson, the gang leader I captured, had an older brother named Richard, a businessman with connections to several territories. We could never prove he funded his brother's activities, but many suspected it. Finch was alive when Harrington left at 9, Rebecca continued. I believe Richard Carson arrived early, perhaps on yesterday's evening stage instead of today's, and killed Finch himself. Either to avoid paying for the business or to ensure Finch couldn't reveal the true nature of their arrangement." Sheriff Billings looked skeptical. "That's quite a theory, Miss Sinclair, but without evidence. Check the stage records," Daniel suggested. "If Carson arrived yesterday evening rather than today as expected, it would support Rebecca's theory." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded to his deputy. "Go ask Simmons at the stage office who came in on yesterday's evening run." While they waited for the deputy's return, Daniel moved to Rebecca's side. "This was dangerous, investigating on your own," he murmured, his good hand finding hers. "No more dangerous than facing 3 gunmen," she countered softly. The deputy returned quickly, excitement on his young face. "Sheriff, Simmons says a man matching Carson's description did arrive on last night's stage around 7. Registered at the hotel under the name Richard Smith. Smith, Daniel repeated with a grim smile. Not exactly creative. Sheriff Billings stood, adjusting his gun belt. I suppose we should pay Mr. Smith a visit at the hotel. Blackwood, you stay here. This is official business. With all due respect, Sheriff, Daniel replied, if this is Richard Carson, he's extremely dangerous, and he has a personal vendetta against me. All the more reason for you to stay put, Billings insisted. Sheriff, Rebecca interjected, Mr. Blackwood has more experience with dangerous men than anyone in this town, and his arm may be injured, but he can still shoot better with his right hand than most men with both. Billings looked between them, clearly recognizing the truth in her words. Fine, but you follow my lead, Blackwood, and Miss Sinclair, you're staying here where it's safe. For once, Rebecca didn't argue. She had done her part by uncovering the truth. Now it was time to let Daniel and the sheriff do theirs. As the men prepared to leave, Daniel turned to her. Thank you, he said simply, for believing in me, for fighting for me. Always, she promised, rising on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. Be careful. I will. His eyes held a promise of their own. We have plans to make when this is over. Rebecca watched from the jail window as Daniel and Sheriff Billings headed toward the hotel, a sense of both fear and hope battling in her chest. Whatever happened next would determine not just Daniel's future in Silver Creek, but their future together. The confrontation at the hotel was brief but tense. Richard Carson, cornered in his room, initially denied all knowledge of Finch's murder. But when faced with the evidence Rebecca had gathered, and the testimony of witnesses who placed him near Finch's office at the likely time of the murder, he attempted to escape through a window. Sheriff Billings, showing unexpected agility, tackled him to the ground. A search of Carson's luggage revealed a revolver with one bullet fired, the ballistics of which, Doc Sullivan confirmed, matched the bullet removed from Finch's body. By sunset, Richard Carson was behind bars, charged with the murder of Jacob Finch and conspiracy related to the attack on Daniel. In his confession, extracted with the promise of avoiding the hangman's noose, Carson admitted he had orchestrated everything as revenge against Daniel for his brother's capture. He took my brother's freedom, Carson had reportedly said, so I decided to take everything he cared about. The story spread quickly through Silver Creek, transforming Daniel from suspicious outsider to hero in the eyes of many townsfolk. By the time he and Rebecca walked arm in arm to dinner at the hotel restaurant that evening, a celebration suggested by Mrs. Cooper, they received nods of respect and even a few congratulatory comments. It seems you've been accepted by Silver Creek, Rebecca observed as they were seated at the best table in the small dining room. Daniel smiled, his eyes never leaving her face. I'm more concerned with being accepted by one particular resident. Rebecca's heart fluttered at the intensity of his gaze. I believe that was settled this morning before we were so rudely interrupted by a murder investigation. His smile deepened as he reached across the table to take her hand. Indeed it was, though I realize I never properly asked the question. He glanced around the crowded restaurant. This isn't exactly the romantic setting I had in mind, but after the events of the past 2 days, I'm disinclined to wait for perfect circumstances. Before Rebecca could respond, Daniel slid from his chair to kneel beside her table, still holding her hand. A hush fell over the restaurant as diners realized what was happening. Rebecca Sinclair, Daniel said, his deep voice carrying in the sudden silence. 1 week ago, I saw you standing on an auction block, facing unimaginable humiliation with more dignity and courage than most men show in a lifetime of trials. In that moment, something changed in me, something I thought had died years ago. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as Daniel continued. I told myself I was merely doing what any decent man would do, but the truth is, from that first moment, you awakened something in my heart that I never expected to feel again. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small gold ring, simple but elegantly crafted. I bought this today, hoping you might wear it as a symbol of my promise to love, honor, and protect you for all the days of my life. Rebecca, will you marry me? The tears spilled over as Rebecca nodded, too overcome for words at first. Yes, she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Daniel Blackwood, I will marry you. A cheer erupted from the other diners as Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, his good arm encircling her waist to draw her close. Rebecca leaned into him, savoring the warmth and strength of the man who had saved her in more ways than one. Later, as they walked back to the boarding house under a canopy of stars, Rebecca's hand securely tucked in the crook of Daniel's arm, she considered the extraordinary path that had led them to this moment. A week ago, I thought my life was over, she mused. Now it feels as though it's just beginning. Daniel stopped walking to look down at her, his face illuminated by the silver moonlight. Life has a way of surprising us. I came to Silver Creek tracking a fugitive, only to find a future I never imagined possible. What will that future look like? Rebecca asked, genuinely curious. Will you continue your work as a manhunter? Daniel shook his head. No, that life is behind me now. I've been thinking about what comes next, actually. He resumed walking, leading her toward the boarding house. The bank now holds all of Finch's assets, including the debt collection business. Harrington approached me this afternoon about purchasing it. Rebecca looked up in surprise. You? Why? Apparently, my reputation for fairness, despite my profession, has reached his ears. He believes I could transform the business into something that serves the community rather than preys upon it. Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. I'm considering it. With fair terms and honest practices, debt collection could be a necessary service rather than an instrument of extortion. That's not what I expected, Rebecca admitted. Daniel smiled down at her. Nor I. But it would allow us to build a life here in Silver Creek, to put down roots, perhaps even buy back your father's store eventually if that's something you'd want. The idea of reclaiming her father's legacy brought fresh tears to Rebecca's eyes. I would like that very much, and I think my father would be proud to see his store in our hands. Then that's what we'll work toward, Daniel promised as they reached the boarding house. Together, Mrs. Cooper was waiting for them on the porch, her face alight with anticipation. One look at Rebecca's glowing expression and the ring on her finger told her all she needed to know. Well, it's about time, the widow declared, embracing them both. I knew from the moment you rode up on that horse, Mr. Blackwood, that you were the answer to my prayers for this dear girl. Your prayers, Mrs. Cooper? Rebecca asked, surprised. Of course. I've been praying for a good man to recognize your worth since the day your father passed. Mrs. Cooper wiped a tear from her eye. Though I must admit, I never expected him to arrive quite so dramatically, paying your freedom in gold like some hero from a storybook. Daniel laughed, the sound rich and warm in the night air. I'm no storybook hero, Mrs. Cooper. Just a man fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time. The right place at the right time, Rebecca repeated softly, leaning into his embrace. Perhaps that's the definition of destiny. 3 months later, on a crisp October morning, Rebecca Sinclair became Rebecca Blackwood in a simple ceremony at Silver Creek's small church. The town turned out in force to witness the union of the woman who had endured public shame with such dignity, and the man who had rescued her with an act of extraordinary generosity. Daniel, resplendent in a new suit, watched with wonder as Rebecca walked down the aisle in a gown she had designed and sewn herself, ivory satin with delicate lace trim, more beautiful than anything that could be purchased from a catalog or city shop. Their vows were straightforward but heartfelt, promises to love and cherish each other through whatever challenges life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel's kiss was both tender and passionate, a perfect reflection of the man himself. The celebration afterward at Mrs. Cooper's boarding house, expanded for the occasion with tables set up in the garden, continued well into the evening. Rebecca and Daniel moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes from people who had become not just neighbors but friends. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the gathering, Daniel led Rebecca away from the festivities to a quiet corner of the garden. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Completely," she assured him, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." His blue eyes held hers with an intensity that still made her breath catch. "I have something to show you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded document which he handed to Rebecca. She opened it curiously, then gasped as she read the contents. "The deed to my father's store," she whispered, looking up at him in disbelief. "How did you?" "The bank was more than willing to sell it to us, especially after Harrington's son took over management last month." Daniel smiled at her astonishment. "It needs some work, but it's ours. We can open for business whenever you're ready." Tears of joy filled Rebecca's eyes as she threw her arms around his neck. "Thank you, Daniel. This means more to me than I can say." "It's just the beginning," he promised, holding her close, "the beginning of the life we'll build together." As dusk settled over Silver Creek, the newlyweds bid farewell to their guests and departed in a buggy decorated with ribbons and flowers. They drove not to a hotel or the boarding house, but to a small house at the edge of town, another surprise Daniel had arranged, a place of their own where they could start their new life together. That night, as they lay entwined in the intimacy of their marriage bed, Rebecca reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From the shame of the auction block to the joy of their wedding day, from bondage to freedom, from isolation to love. "What are you thinking?" Daniel murmured, pressing a kiss to her bare shoulder. Rebecca turned in his arms to face him, her heart full to overflowing. "I'm thinking that sometimes the darkest moments of our lives can lead us to the brightest light. If I hadn't been on that auction block, I would have found you anyway," Daniel finished with certainty. "Some things are meant to be, Rebecca. You and I were one of those things." And as he drew her into another kiss, Rebecca knew with absolute conviction that he was right. Their love had been forged in unusual circumstances, tempered by danger and sacrifice, but it had emerged stronger for those trials. What had begun with a cowboy paying for a stranger's freedom in gold had transformed into something far more precious, a love that would endure for all the days of their lives. 5 years later, Rebecca stood in the doorway of Blackwood General Store, watching as Daniel helped their 3-year-old son, George, arrange a display of candy sticks in the glass jar on the counter. Their daughter, Sarah, just 1 year old, slept peacefully in the cradle Rebecca had positioned behind the register where she could keep an eye on her while working. The store had flourished under their management, expanding to offer not just the usual provisions but also Rebecca's handmade clothing and Daniel's remarkably fair financial services. The debt collection business had been transformed into something the community valued rather than feared, with Daniel working out reasonable payment plans for those who had fallen on hard times. Silver Creek itself had grown as well, with a new railroad spur bringing increased trade and prosperity. The town that had once witnessed Rebecca's deepest humiliation now held her greatest joys: her home, her business, her family. "Mama, look," George called excitedly, pointing to the perfectly arranged candy display. "Papa and I did it." "It looks wonderful, sweetheart," Rebecca praised, moving to ruffle her son's dark hair so like his father's. "What a good helper you are." Daniel straightened, his eyes finding hers with the same warmth that had captivated her from the beginning. At 38, he was even more handsome than he had been when they met, the silver beginning to thread through his hair at the temples only adding to his distinguished appearance. "I was thinking," he said, lifting George into his arms, "that we might close early today." "It's the anniversary of when we met, after all." Rebecca smiled, touched that he remembered. 5 years ago today. "The best day of my life," Daniel declared, leaning over the counter to kiss her softly. Even if the circumstances were less than ideal, George squirmed between them. "Tell the story, Papa. about how you saved Mama. It had become a favorite bedtime tale, carefully edited for young ears. Daniel exchanged an amused glance with Rebecca before addressing their son. Well, son, your mama was in trouble, and I happened to be riding through town. I had some gold with me, and I used it to help her. Then I discovered she was the most beautiful, bravest woman I'd ever met, and I fell in love with her. And then you got married and had me, George concluded triumphantly. Eventually, yes, Daniel agreed with a laugh. Though there were a few adventures in between. The bell above the door jingled as Mrs. Cooper entered the store. Now in her 70s but still spry, she had become like a grandmother to their children. "There's my favorite family," she declared, accepting George's enthusiastic hug. "I came to see if you might need a babysitter tonight. I heard it's a special anniversary." Rebecca exchanged a surprised look with Daniel. "How did you, my dear, I may be old, but my memory is sharp as ever," Mrs. Cooper said with a wink. 5 years ago today, a tall stranger rode into town and changed everything. She reached into her basket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. A little something to mark the occasion. Daniel accepted the gift, unwrapping it to reveal a small framed photograph of their family. Taken just a month earlier, Daniel and Rebecca seated with Sarah on her lap, and George standing proudly beside his father. "Our first family portrait," Rebecca said softly, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "For two people who found each other in the most unlikely circumstances," Mrs. Cooper said, "and built something beautiful from what could have been tragedy." She held out her arms. "Now, why don't you let me take these little ones for the evening? The miller's daughter just made the most delicious apple pie, and I happen to have purchased one for dessert." With the children happily departed with Mrs. Cooper, Daniel and Rebecca closed the store early as planned. They walked hand in hand through town, acknowledging greetings from neighbors and friends, until they reached the creek where they had shared their first lunch together. The spot was unchanged, the same cottonwood tree, the same grassy bank, the same peaceful burble of water over stones. Daniel spread a blanket on the ground and produced a basket containing bread, cheese, and apple slices, an echo of that first simple meal. "You planned this," Rebecca accused with a smile as they settled on the blanket. "Guilty," Daniel admitted, uncorking a bottle of wine. "I wanted to recreate that day. It was the first time I truly allowed myself to hope for a future with you." Rebecca accepted a glass of wine, studying his beloved face over the rim. "Did you ever imagine, sitting here that day, that we would build all this together? The store, our home, our children? I hoped," Daniel said simply, "but the reality has far exceeded even my most optimistic dreams." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "Another tradition I'd like to establish, a gift each year on the anniversary of when we met." Rebecca opened the box to find a delicate gold locket. Inside were tiny portraits of George and Sarah. "It's beautiful, Daniel, thank you." He helped her fasten it around her neck, his fingers lingering on her skin. "I have one more surprise," he said, his voice taking on an excited quality she didn't often hear. "I received a letter from the territorial governor yesterday. They're establishing a proper court system in Silver Creek, and they've asked me to consider the position of judge." Rebecca's eyes widened. "Judge Blackwood, Daniel, that's wonderful." "It would mean giving up the debt collection business," he cautioned. "But we have the store, and this would be a way to serve the community on a larger scale." "You should accept," Rebecca said without hesitation. "You have the perfect temperament for it, fair but firm, compassionate but clear-headed." She squeezed his hand. "I'm so proud of you, Daniel, of the man you are, of the life you've built with me." His eyes darkened with emotion as he drew her into his arms. "Everything good in my life came from that day at the auction block," he murmured against her hair. "From the moment I saw you standing there with your head held high despite everything." Rebecca leaned back to look into his face. "We've come a long way from that day." "And we have a long way yet to go," Daniel said, his voice a promise. "Together." As the sun began to set over Silver Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Daniel and Rebecca Blackwood shared a kiss beside the creek where their courtship had truly begun. From the ashes of shame and despair, they had built a life of love, purpose, and joy, a testament to the healing power of compassion and the enduring strength of the human heart. And far in the distance, beyond the rolling hills and sprawling plains, a future stretched before them, bright with possibility, rich with promise, and secured by the unbreakable bond they had forged between them.